Let's try something. Hold up your hand. Can you think of 5 different books, movies, games with a transmasculine character, or that in another way discuss transmasculinity? Take your time. No Googling, and these must be stories that you've personally consumed. How are you doing? Most people I tested this on failed. How did you do? 34 pieces of media, mostly books, one game, some short stories, and some novellas, featuring transmasculine characters or discussions of transmasculinity, or allegories to transmasculinity. 19 are by writers who have been open to varying degrees about being transmasculine themselves. That's 19 out of 34 books. Taking into account that I'm seeking author variety, I'm going out of my way to make sure I'm reading books by different authors, obviously. The whole goal here is to eventually put together a list of things that I've personally read and discussed. So I need to make sure that I'm not just reading from the same 10 authors over and over again. However, that means that 56% of these authors can safely be assumed to be transmasculine people. Now, of these, overall 34 pieces of media, only 6 have over 1,000 ratings on popular rating and review sites such as Goodreads. 11 have over 100, 21 have less than 50. That's about 62% that have under 50 ratings on the most popular book rating sites. So I think we have a visibility issue here. And to clarify, I am seeking out lots of independent pieces of media as well, but not all of these are indie. And it is also worth noting that the ones that primarily are indie pieces of media tend to also be by transmasculine authors or trans authors in general. Now, some of you might be wondering why I'm focusing explicitly on transmasculine characters' stories in this video so far. That is because that is the project that I am focusing on here. If you are looking for transfeminine representation, discussion of transfeminine literature, I actually strongly recommend that you look into the Transfeminine Review. I will have her Blue Sky and her website in both the description of this video. She does excellent work, and if you're looking for those resources, they are right there for you. I'm not really interested in playing a sort of us versus them game here. I don't think that how much representation one group of trans people has versus another is remotely an interesting discussion or a worthwhile game to play. It doesn't really help us in the long run of providing resources and information for everyone. It just kind of fuels an argument that leads us nowhere. So the resources are there if you are looking for transfeminine representation. If you are in this video interested in what I'm talking about explicitly, then I will continue with that. But I will not entertain the notion or the argument of any sort of us versus them mentality. I'm not interested in it. Now, before I dig into sort of why I'm doing this, how I'm doing it, how I'm going to go about it, what you can expect, I want to quickly make a little segue that I will do in every single video of this series as long as this is a relevant conversation. I think, even especially if you're here watching videos about trans people, trans stories, I think that it is especially important that you care about what is happening in the world. I think that you should care what is happening in Ukraine, what is happening in Palestine, and I think that you should seek out resources to donate if you have the money or to share if you don't. I don't think that that's something that we should be glossing over and just kind of pushing to the side. It kind of goes hand in hand with these politics of like we're talking about discussing trans stories as, you know, resistance to fascism. How dare us not talk about this or share resources for it? You know, I think that it's cowardly behavior, if nothing else. So I am going to list resources also in the description for you to check out to donate to. There will be a link for the Come Back Alive Foundation. We will have one for the National Bank of Ukraine, the Serhiy Prytula Charity Foundation, the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, the Palestine Red Crescent Society, and Doctors Without Borders. And also my Ko-fi will be linked in the description too. And any donations that go to my Ko-fi, I send to direct aid such as GoFundMes. I've been doing that for a long time now. I'm probably going to keep doing that for the foreseeable future. I can't see that changing. I do have some exclusive content on there, like some artwork, some writing for like $1 if you want to see it, but all of that money is explicitly for fundraising, and all of the money that I get for book sales for the novella that I have released and for the book that I am working on releasing, all of the money from those book sales is also going to be donated to various fundraising organizations or just straight up direct aid. And I don't have a time frame on that for you guys. I think I'm just going to keep doing that. So thank you for being interested in, the video I'm making, but also please don't forget to show your support to everyone who needs it, not just groups that you might be part of. I think that that's a fair thing to ask. So where did this really start? What are the origins of it? What do you need to know? I have been looking for trans stories since I was in my early 20s, when I first came out. And it's not quite a decade ago. It's getting on a decade ago, so it's been a while. And when I was first looking, I would say I was around 21 or 22, and I was specifically looking through things like anime and manga and movies, not quite books yet. I was looking for more mainstream things that people might know about, right? And in total, I think I found like 3 things with a transmasculine character in them. One of them was Boys Don't Cry. One of them was the movie that I believe was renamed to 3 Generations. And I'll probably talk about those later at some point more in depth. And the other was the anime Wandering Sun, which I will also probably talk about more in depth later. And that was basically it. I had a really hard time finding anything, and it was disheartening to the point where I kind of just stopped looking for a while, and then eventually decided to start making my own stories, characters, etc., which seems to be a pretty common journey for the average trans writer. I think that's a story that I've seen repeated, everywhere when you talk to anyone, right? Who is an author who is trans. You see it very commonly. I recently, and by recently I mean maybe within the past year, I was starting to talk about like, hey, I'm seeking out independently published books now more than I used to, because I like them. I think that they have a lot more daring and interesting stories, and I found a lot more stories centering trans characters in this realm of written work, of literature. And then I thought, okay, what if I track specifically the ones that have transmasculine characters in them, and I make just like a little list of ones I've read that I can share with people? Because whenever I go on the internet, or just to anyone really, and I talk about like, oh, I've read this thing with a transmasculine character, I read this book, I get this very common response, especially from other transmasculine people, where they're basically like, oh, well, where did you find that? Do you have any more? I never can find anything. I can't find anything except like Cremisius and Dragon Age Inquisition, right? And so I was thinking, all right, probably making a list is a good idea. And then I got very enabled into this, I would say. The suggestion was sort of piqued by a friend of mine, and then it got more attention than I expected it to. And then I realized that maybe this is a thing that actually needs to be done. So I started reading specifically more things for this, and then I got more ideas, and it turned a little bit more interesting. And I realized that there's a lot of reoccurring tropes and themes and like things that require, well, not require, but that deserve, I would say, some focus of literature analysis in this area of storytelling, of media, focusing on these sorts of characters, and there really isn't much that exists. You might find the odd article. There's a really interesting article on Mulan. I will track that down and put a link to that in the description, for example. But you really have a hard time finding just about anything that focuses exclusively on literature analysis of the tropes and themes around transmasculine characters in media. It's just not a field that I think I've really seen anyone dedicate any large amount of time to exploring. Whether that's because there just isn't enough stories in to explore, or whether it's because no one's interested, or whether it's because no one, I don't know, knows that trans guys exist. I don't know. But it's just not something that I've seen. So I thought, okay, what if I just do it? It's not like there's anything stopping me. And then that kind of led to this. The main reason I'm doing it is because I really haven't seen it done anywhere else or by anyone else other than maybe like the odd article here and there. And I think that it deserves more space and discussion. And if it's got to be me, then I guess it's me. I have some friends helping me along the way, and you'll probably meet them throughout this series. But that's it. That's the crux of it. That's really truly why I'm doing this. You know, like, and I have a lot of personal anecdotal experiences about like making comments, you know, related to this sort of subject in large social groups. I think there was one instance where I made a joke about how Mulan should have been able to transition, and I got told that I was taking rep away from strong women by suggesting that. So you know, we have a couple things here. We have a couple things to unpack, and that's what we're going to be doing with this series. I think the best analogy I can think of, and I think that this is very important to consider when we're having discussions about any kind of analysis of trans storytelling, be it transfem, transmasc, non-binary, although I'd argue that non-binary can also kind of sway into being like transfeminine, transmasc, because I'll be discussing, you know, non-binary characters and stories here, like transmasculine, non-binary. I think that it's relevant, right? I think that a good way to think about it is think about the way that, like, if so let's say you are really into fashion history, which I've definitely had my moments of spiraling into being interested in that. Fashion history is fascinating. Now, fashion history ties to real world history because the way that people dress reflects the, you know, political climate and the world that they are in. I think that that's a very interesting thing to think about. So when you're talking about fashion history, and let's say you are a scholar of fashion history, every single person in that field will have like one specific decade. And not just that, they'll have one specific decade, probably from one specific country, that they pay attention to, that they become an expert in. And then that's their field, right? And I think you can apply that same logic to analyzing and, you know, discussing transgender characters in media. I think that there are going to inherently be a lot of different tropes and themes and things that need to be unpacked about transmasculine characters versus transfeminine characters versus non-binary characters that don't fall into either category. I think that, like, all of us who want to get into literature analysis specifically for trans stuff, trans things, we're going to end up picking a specific niche, a very specific topic that fascinates us the most. And that's going to be the primary thing that we pick apart, that we discuss, that we read, that we, you know, write essays on, that we make videos on. Because if I were to try to discuss all of trans representation in this series, it would be extremely broad. It would be a lot more non-specific. I would end up probably over-repping some groups and under-repping other groups, and that is a huge part of why there is like discourse and arguments about it, because when you do that to groups of people that are universally underrepresented, or when we do get rep, it's like often not good, right? When you do that and you pick one and you favor them, and then you go, I'm talking about trans literature, but you're only talking about like one specific fraction of it, everyone else that you're kind of just throwing, to the side is going to notice and they're going to feel that. So I think that we need to be more comfortable with stating specifically that, like me, I'm interested in trans literature. I read trans literature, whether it's, whether it's whatever. There are trans femme authors that I read from, there are trans femme stories that I like. There are some I'm reading right now, but they're not what I'm interested in picking apart and discussing from a literature analysis angle for a long-term project such as this. I'm specifically interested in transmasculine characters and stories, and that's what I'm going to do. You know what I'm going to do. I am specifically choosing to, talk about this very specific thing, not to say that nothing else deserves to be discussed, but that's just not the field that I'm discussing. There are other people that are doing it, and I can point you towards them. And I think that we as a group, I would say, I don't know what I would call this group, the nerds of trans people that do media analysis. I think that we need to be a lot more comfortable being pointed about the specific things that we're doing media analysis of, so that we make sure that we're not giving people false promises, that we're not accidentally underrepping groups and pretending that it's okay that they're underrepped. I think that we just need to be more honest. And that is another thing I want to point out as well to you. So now I probably should tell you about the specific kind of things I'm looking for and that I plan on discussing throughout this. I made a list of guidelines, and I'm going to kind of read them out to you and discuss them a little bit. And then I made a little bit of a representation test, I will say, in quotes. Kind of, I'll explain it. Now, all of these will be fueling the way that I dissect whatever it is I talk about throughout this series. And it will kind of be how I decide what I think would be, something I would recommend versus something that I would probably not recommend, but that I still might want to discuss. I think that that's kind of a good differentiation. So my guidelines here, for something that I would say must go on the, I'll put in quotes positive, but like by positive, I specifically mean something that I think, if a like 20-year-old trans guy came up to me and asked me for recommendations for something, when I say positive, I mean it's on a list of things I might recommend him to look into, because I think that maybe he might connect to them or find something interesting in them. I think that that is kind of what I say when I say positive rep, that's kind of what I mean. I don't mean that the character has to be like a goody two-shoes or that the story can't have violence. I just mean that like I have to be able to, for the most part, comfortably recommend it with some level of confidence that who I'm recommending it to might get something out of it and to some extent enjoy it. That's what I mean by that. So the literature must center a transmasculine character and or transmasculine experiences. So I think that a huge thing, especially in congruence with the test that I had listed earlier, is that a lot of the things that people will say, oh, I read this thing that has a trans guy in it. The trans guy is like a supporting character that has like 2 scenes. Like that's a really common trend among that, right? Like I have to go and quantify that maybe with numbers at some point because, I love numbers. But if you just like look at recommendation lists, it very rarely is the transmasculine character one of the primary characters in the story. That's not typically how it goes. So I would say for something like that I might toss on my yes list. I think that he needs to at the very least be a very important character in the story. Now next I go on to describe what transmasculine is defined as for this broad project, for the document that I'm making discussing this, mostly for my own personal notes. So transmasculine is defined as someone assigned female who transitions socially and or medically to be read as masculine. They do not need to be a trans man binarily. We welcome stories about non-binary transmasculinity. So I touched on that before, but basically yes, this will not specifically be about trans men. It will just be about anyone under the transmasculine umbrella. So there will be NB stuff here as well. In this project, I will focus on literature. No word count limit, poetry and prose are both welcome. The literature can either be purchasable or posted online. Thusly, we can recommend it via an online master list. So basically, it just has to be like accessible. Like I had to be able to recommend it and go here and buy or read this, right? Like if I can't do that, I can't discuss and recommend it. So I'm explicitly not going to discuss things that are not available for purchase or for, reading of any kind. I don't think that is going to, do a lot of good here, right? The gender of the author does not matter. We will note if the author is openly transmasculine, transfeminine, and/or non-binary. We will note pronouns. We will not assume that they are cis, nor do the stories here have to be written by transmasculine authors. So that's pretty self-explanatory. I'm just looking for like the work itself. And this extends, there's a later point that goes more into it, but it won't just be literature. And I don't really care necessarily, if the actor is trans, if the author is trans. Like, I'll note those things if they're true, because yes, like those are wins for sure. But I am explicitly here to discuss the stories and the characters on a storytelling level, which don't necessitate me to discuss the author in depth. So, generally speaking, I'm not going to, put a whole lot of discussion into the author. Like, let's say there are authors I discuss for certain things here that maybe have somewhat controversial online presences. Okay, that's valid. I might make a slight note of that in the video, where I'll be like, I understand what, like, if you don't like this person, that's fine. But it's not what I'm talking about. I'm just going to talk about the actual written work that I'm focused on and the stuff that is in the written work. That's my primary focus. The literature on this list, so the recommendation lists that I will make, must feature positive and affirming transmasculine representation. The characters and stories can be morally gray and or dark, but the transmasculinity itself must not fall into anti-transmasculine tropes. These tropes will be further expounded upon, which I will discuss in a little bit after this. But basically, and people really get, I think the best word is uppity. This is kind of a discoursey topic when it's like, well, what is good representation? I think that you can define good representation pretty easily, actually. I don't think it needs to be a complicated concept. I think that if the representation in a certain piece is objectively harmful, like it is playing into harmful stereotypes and tropes, I think that we can discuss that. But I don't think that the character in question has to be, like, in the case of, trans guys especially, this sort of like ooh soft boy, like, I don't think they have to. Like, sure, if they are, I don't really care. Like, it's not like a problem for me. But I don't think that they need to be. I think that you can have edgy trans guys. You can have you can have extremely edgy transmasculine stories, and I think that that's perfectly fine. In fact, a lot of them I really like. So, I mean, you can have some that might be, like I say with the heaviest of quotes, problematic, because the representation is very nuanced and it tackles, hard to read about things. I think that that's interesting and fine. I'm not going to sort of put, I'm not going to put stories like onto sort of moral pedestals. I'm not going to assume the morals of the authors. I think that that's ultimately pointless, and I think that it's detrimental to representation, generally speaking. I think that when I say good representation, I'm hoping that you can understand what I mean by that, and basically what I mean is, can I recommend this to the average trans guy who's looking for something that he might be able to see himself in or connect to? He just wants something with a trans guy in it. Can I recommend this to him with some level of assurance that, that he's going to get something enjoyable or positive out of it? Like, am I thinking about, like, let's talk about Boys Don't Cry briefly. Boys Don't Cry is an interesting movie, but, and like, I wouldn't say that it's necessarily, bigoted in its existence. I don't think it's inherently anti-transmasculine, but it falls into this category where I actually can't really recommend it. Like, due to the subject matter itself, I can't recommend it to a trans guy who's like, oh, I'm looking for something with representation. I'm not going to tell him to go watch Boys Don't Cry. I'm just not going to do that. it's not that it's bad. It's not that I think that, but it does somewhat fall under an umbrella of not great representation if you can't even recommend it to the, target demographic that the representation is kind of for. I think that that's kind of where I'm kind of starting to draw a line in the sand. I hope that that makes sense to you. So, just for a couple examples, literature featuring transmasculine characters whose bodies are described as mutilated as it pertains to their transness. I think that that is pretty anti-transmasculine. Like if we're reading a book and the character has top surgery scars, and then his body is described as butchered looking, or the way that it's described is very aggressive, I think that that is pretty anti-transmasculine for sure. I don't feel like I need to explain that, but there's not very many contexts in which, something doing that is something that I can go, oh yeah, this is good and fine. I think that that won't upset anybody or be potentially harmful to the target demographic I'm making this for, right? If the transmasculine character is not integral to the story in a narrative sense. I've discussed this prior, but I think it's worth saying again. A huge problem is that you'll have a character for kind of token representation. This is not exclusive to trans guys or transmasculine. All this happens to almost every single marginalized group. But if the character is just kind of there for the token rep and doesn't really have any story presence and doesn't do anything in the story, like that's kind of like not great. I think that that's also, kind of what I might say is bad rep, right? If that's the case. If the story presents the transmasculine character as any form of misogynistic stereotype. So, I actually kind of can explain this one slightly because it just kind of sounds a little bit like word soup, and I'm trying to avoid sounding like that to you. But basically, when we're talking about misogynistic ways to write women, right? A lot of people will subvert those tropes. So, for example, they'll like sexy bimbo, woman character who's not very smart, but she's really hot, and like when there's an abundance of that and the character and she has no other character, or let's say, a really common one is when women exist exclusively to be love interests and we don't see them, do we don't really have an idea of who they are. They kind of just exist, and it's to an extent a love interest always exists solely to be a love interest, right? But if the character is not fleshed out to any degree past being a love interest, that is a huge issue when it comes to women in any form of media. It's a huge problem when it comes to writing women, actually. I would argue that simply subverting that to a male character, which a lot of people will do, for example, they'll do that to kind of point out the trope, and also it's a very, good example, if any of you are familiar with the gender bent Ghostbusters. It's not really gender bent. I watched the movie. They're kind of their own characters. And to be clear, I don't hate the movie that much. I think that it's relatively fine. But I think that it's worth noting that the male secretary in that movie kind of exemplifies this. He is basically the sexy bimbo character, the sexy secretary, but he's a man, so he's kind of subverting it, which is where the comedy is coming from in that character, right? And I don't, on paper, have an issue with that. I think it's an interesting way to discuss these tropes and to subvert them, and it kind of gives us something to, I don't know, it gives us something to chew on. I think it can be interesting. But I think if you're writing a trans man or a transmasculine character, in any form, and you write them that way, and it doesn't click in your head that just because the character is a man, you're thinking, oh, well, he's a man, so it's okay for me to subvert, this kind of stereotype by writing him as it because he's a man. The issue is that you're forgetting that he's also trans. So, the misogynistic stereotype when you're writing it about a trans man is just misogyny. It's not even really subverted. It's just it is the same problem that you can potentially use the fact that he's trans to cover up. But if, like, and I'm saying this with the heaviest of quotes, if the character didn't transition, if he stayed a woman, then it'd be misogynistic, right? Like, to write her like that. But it's okay to do it to the transmasculine characters. It's almost kind of like a punishment. It's very hard to describe, but I've seen it happen, and I'm sure there will be multiple examples throughout where I kind of mention it's kind of doing that throughout this. And that's an issue, I think. I think that we need to be kind of cognizant of that. So that's what I mean when I say that here. And then I tacked on a little thing at the end. The book in question must pass the Skalozub test. So you're like, okay, what is the Skalozub test? The Skalozub test is a little test that I made, and I made it because of stuff I was reading for this project, actually. And I will not be, naming the specific things in question because I'm not really interested in that. But I am interested in discussing this on an overall sort of broad level. So the Skalozub test is sort of a little very short thing I made to determine if the transmasculine character in question is a token or if he's actually a character in the story. So the way that I wrote it, it goes like this. To determine if a story featuring a transmasculine character is representation or tokenization. Or question 1. Is the transmasculine character, there must be at least one transmasculine character, is the transmasculine character named? And this must be a yes, with an extremely minor exception if we're talking about a story where little to no characters have names. So if it's an overall thing for like all the characters in the story, obviously he's not being singled out. But if like most of the characters in the story, the recurring ones, have names, but the transmasculine character is not explicitly named or name dropped, yeah. And also, yes, I've encountered that. Everything on here I have encountered, that's why it is on this list. Just for clarification, I'm not pulling this out of nowhere. Is the transmasculine character in more than one scene in the story? And this must be a yes. And again, minor asterisk exception, if you have a story that is only like 1 to 3 scenes long because it's that short, then obviously no, this would not be about that. But if we're talking about a story that has, multiple scenes throughout it, multiple opportunities, but you've only put the transmasculine character in one of those scenes, it's not looking good, right? And then, is the transmasculine character given more than just a couple lines of dialogue? And this must be a yes, but a potential exception for stories that overall, for everyone, have little to no dialogue. So, generally speaking, all of these questions you must be able to answer with an easy yes, before I would say that it passes my personal test of, do you even have a transmasculine character in the story, or is it just a little token that you tossed in there and you didn't flesh out, right? And I think that you can actually extrapolate this for like a lot of different kinds of rep in general, but I did make this specifically for this because these were things that I noticed to be issues, because people will be like, oh, there's a trans guy in this story, and then you read it and he's barely there. Like, you could cut him out and it makes no difference to the story. So that's kind of where I made this. And while yes, I acknowledge that this can be used for any other marginalized group, and you're free to do so, by the way, that's why it is specifically here. And there's a couple bonus rules if you want extra credit. So these are kind of things that I'm looking for, to quantify if I'm thinking like, oh, okay, this isn't bad, right? So is he relevant to the story in at least 1/3 of the page time? Now, this is hard to quantify, but more or less, if you can cut him out and very little to nothing changes, then I don't think it counts as representation. Now, is he presented, and this is the next one, is he presented in such a way that his transmasculinity is not vilified even if he is an antagonist? And this must be a yes. So there will be some actually that I'm discussing throughout this that I think will not pass this and that will kind of open up the discussion. But basically, if you have a trans character in your story, and this could be for any kind of trans character, by the way, and their transness is part of what fuels their villainy and their evil actions, then I would argue that it's probably not great representation. Like, you can make, a villain that just happens to be trans. It doesn't have to be, like, deeper than that. Or if you are going to incorporate it, then at least do it in, like, an interesting way where it's not, like, just because the character's trans, right? Like, it's very uncreative, I would say, it is the biggest thing. But also, yeah, it is used to fuel, like, negative stereotypes, for sure, that's the thing. And then the last one is he presented in the story only to serve another character's arc as a thematic element or a love interest or a sexual conquest. And this one must be a no. If you are writing the transmasculine character as a token / a check of a box, then like it's not representation, which I think is the main crux of this, right? And that last one kind of ties into the like misogynistic ways that women are written in fiction. Like, if you have a trans guy in a story and he's just there because he's supporting someone else, but he doesn't really have his own arc or his own characterization. If he's only there because someone else wants to get in his pants or like date him and he doesn't really have much past being like a motivation or a conquest for another character or support, then it kind of becomes a little bit questionable for me. He does have to, to some extent, on his own stand as a character and have like his own characterization. I think that that's a decent standard to have here. Okay, well, I can't believe that I recorded a whole bit and I have to redo it because it disconnected. What a piss off. Okay, so how am I going to do this? How am I going to go about making this whole thing? Well, I have been reading for some time. I would say for the past few months, I've been, collecting books, reading them, discussing them, making notes, and it's been ongoing, and it will continue to be ongoing. I have made 3 categories that I will sort of be putting things in quantifiably. And the first category is, of course, the positive representation category. And by positive, I simply mean I can recommend this to someone with some level of confidence that they might get something out of it. Not necessarily that it's like, I guess, positive morally. We all like dark pieces of media. I think that that's fair. The second category is kind of one of the more interesting ones. It will be pieces of media that I feel don't feature the transmasculine character, enough, or like the discussion of transmasculinity to warrant it being recommended for that feature alone, or at all, really. Like, if I'm reading it and I go, oh, you could just kind of cut this out and it wouldn't make a whole lot of difference to the overall message of the thing or what it's doing or who it's for or whatever, then I won't recommend it for that in the first place. And like anything in this category, for example, like if it's in this category, it means that I did think it was a worthwhile read. It means that I did enjoy it to some extent and that I am recommending it to you, but I'm going to recommend it for other reasons. Now, I might still be critical of things in this category because I am doing this to discuss the transmasculinity of X, Y, and Z piece of media. And so if it's in this category, then of course there's a huge chance that I'm going to be critical of that specific aspect of it. But if I have enough praises for other aspects of it, then I'm going to recommend it for those things, if nothing else. So this is kind of a nuanced category, right? Like, let's say you have, a story or a theory book and it's mentioned marginally, but it doesn't really contribute a whole lot to the discussion, or the character doesn't like do anything in the story, but like it has a lot of, like, let's say it has other trans rep that I think is very good and very interesting. I'll recommend it for that. So that's category 2. Now, category 3 is going to be sort of the one that might warrant some interesting videos. Category 3 is the bad representation category, or basically the way that I would define it is these pieces of media have like offensive or bigoted or poorly handled subject matter in them to the point where I can't really recommend them to anyone, because if I did, I'd have to caveat it so much with But here is all of this stuff you have to watch out for. Like, if I am recommending someone a movie, right? And I have to go, oh, but wait, there's this really racist scene in there. Now, if you can just get past that, and like that's what I mean. Like, it doesn't even have to be specifically like horrifically anti-transmasc. It could be great representation, you know, of a transmasc character, but if it's otherwise, like, say, extremely racist, I'm gonna put it in that category anyway and critique it, because I can't recommend it at that point. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. If it's too broiled down with like actually being offensive and harmful, regardless of who it's offensive and harmful to. But in this case, yeah, we'll be talking about like lots of anti-transmasc stuff. That will be on the table. There are pieces of media that I'm already, you know, working through and planning to read and that I'm going to discuss for this category. But like, if it's bogged down so much by being actually offensive and harmful that I can't even, you know, look at the things about it that are interesting and that are worth considering and recommend it for that, then yes, I will call it bad representation. But as I have stated before, I'm not interested in debating the morals of reading a certain kind of piece of media. I'm not interested in debating the morals of writing it. I think that people can write whatever they want, even if it's hard to write, hard to read. I think that that's perfectly fine. I don't think that we should prescribe morals to, you know, certain books and speculate on the morals of the authors. I think that that's pointless, and I think that it's a very bad way to analyze art anyway, so we're not going to do that. But don't think that I'm just going to like ignore something that it might be horrifically like racist or transphobic, because I absolutely won't do that. So hey, if you're still here, I'm going to assume that you're interested in this project, what I do with it, where I take it, and the kinds of things I will discuss. If there's one thing I can promise you, and if you keep watching this, you will be able to hold up your hand and list 5 pieces of media that feature transmasculine characters easily. You'll be able to list 5 that hopefully you've really enjoyed, but you will be able to actually know about them, because I'm going to go out of my way to discuss as many as possible and to bring as many to the attention of viewers of this that, you know, otherwise have been read by like 3 people and have 4 Goodreads reviews. So that's my real goal. My real goal is that I want to open up the discussion of the tropes and themes around transmasculine characters in writing and literature. I want our stories to be seen, but also what I really want is, one, for you to have easier access finding them. This is technically a resource that I am trying to create, but also I want to do this because I'm hoping. Hope is such a futile word, it doesn't really mean anything, does it? But what I want to do and what I'm aiming to do is to caveat the specific forms of erasure that make it so that, like I said, 64% of the books for what I would consider season 1 of this project have less than 50 ratings. That's a wild number to think about. That means that, like, they have such a small audience that I'm certain when I discuss them, most of you watching probably wouldn't have even heard of them. And like, it's not because they're bad books. It's not just because they're indie books. There are indie books that get very popular too. And the indie writing community and readers have grown exponentially these past few years. But when I'm looking through all these books and I'm seeing like 1 rating, 3 ratings, 10 ratings, you know, like, it's disheartening. It's something that I'm hoping that maybe this will help. And if you stick around, then yeah, you'll be able to answer that question with confidence and with things that you loved. Thank you for watching.